Welcome back. Today we have a fascinating deep dive on the story of Christ's sacrifice with renowned theologian and author Sarah, joining us via satellite. Sarah, can you take us through the concept that's at the heart of today's topic? He who knew no sin became sin.
Sure. Leading up to this episode, we've been walking through the history of the various ways the early church articulated the two natures of Christ, being fully God and fully human. Central to the conversation is the means by which Christ's divinity and humanity work together to reconcile God with sinners.
So to get us up to speed, what's been discussed on this so far?
Let me summarize briefly what's been said up to this point. Over the first 5 centuries, well-meaning pastors and bishops attempted to explain Christ's two natures in relation to his saving work logically, by using classical philosophical explanations and methods. As you heard, these attempts eventually resulted in heresy.
Heresy? That's intense. What was at the core of these misunderstandings?
The root of their errors was in the fact that applying classical philosophical logic and principles to Christ's salvific work is always a matter of being grounded in the law. Simply put, classical philosophy works under the principle of distributive and retributive justice. The law is applied in a fair manner and gives a sinner what he or she deserves. Consequently, using the principles of classical philosophy results in God's reconciling work in Christ being seen as the need to balance the scales of justice according to God's demands in the law.
And what did Luther experience with this?
It was precisely this way of thinking that Luther found himself in when he was a monk. Thus, in his preface to Latin writings, Luther expressed how troubled his conscience was because he couldn't believe that the scales of God's justice were balanced by the sacrificial life Luther lived as a monk.
So Luther struggled with this concept until he saw it in a new way?
Exactly. So Luther wrote, "Thus I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience. Nevertheless, I beat importunately upon Paul at that place, most ardently desiring to know what St. Paul wanted." Simply put, the monk Luther was applying the philosophical ideal of justice to God, just as he'd been taught. And then, as Luther said, he looked more carefully at what Paul said.
And what did Luther find in Paul's teachings?
With that, let's turn to 2 places in Paul that Luther would discover overturn the idea that Christ's saving work occurs in the philosophical ideals of distributive or retributive justice. The first instance is Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 21. "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin." The second is Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 13. "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'"
So, in essence, Christ takes on sin. How does that work exactly?
Let's begin with Christ being made sin. The key here is to start with what is meant by the word sin. Immediately, one's mind goes to actions that transgress the Decalogue, such as stealing, bearing false witness, killing, and adultery. But sin is more than that. As Paul sets forth in Romans 1, those things are simply the symptoms of the bigger disease, namely idolatry. And not just any idolatry, but self-idolatry.
Self-idolatry? Can you explain?
Now let me explain to you what this idolatry looks like and sounds like. Self-idolatry finds a person seeking their own identity as a human being. That person curves in on himself. That person chases after her own existence through her own sense of power. She believes she's in charge of getting her daily bread. It's believing that one's identity is in what one has done and not done. In essence, the sinner is trapped in her own head, thinking she's in charge of her life. And in the process, the sinner is constantly stuck with needing to justify himself according to the law. Self-reflection, self-consciousness, service are all symptoms of this self-idolatry. And as you know, idolatry is breaking the first commandment.
That really changes the way we see sin. So, how does this apply to Christ?
Now let's put that into perspective with Jesus Christ. As we've set forth in previous episodes, he is the true God. So it would make no logical sense that God can break the first commandment. But then, as we've also stated, the incarnation is God becoming human, born of a woman under the law. That is to say, Jesus took on flesh.
And what does taking on human flesh mean for Jesus under the law?
To understand the ramifications of taking on the flesh of humans, we need to turn our attention back to Romans 1, specifically Romans 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. When the Word became flesh, Jesus as a man was placed under the wrath of God. Jesus experienced the full weight of the law and God's wrath against the sin of men.
So there's a dual aspect here of what Jesus endured.
There are two things that happened to Christ when the Word became flesh. The first is that Jesus takes on our sin by experiencing our desire to make the law our righteousness. Think through who it was that persecuted Jesus. Those who wanted to uphold the law at its highest form of morality, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin. They could not tolerate Christ offending the law by forgiving sinners, as opposed to prosecuting the law to its fullest extent. Need an example? Think of the woman caught in adultery. What does the law say she deserves? Death. What does Jesus give her? Mercy. This offends the goal of the law, morality, ethics, the very fabric of civil society. So those responsible for enforcing the law, the religious leaders, applied it to its fullest extent by sentencing Jesus to death.
And his followers, how did they respond?
Now, to make matters even worse, we need to take up the matter of the sinners Jesus forgave, including his very own disciples. Recall what was said above concerning self-idolatry and self-preservation. No one stood up for Jesus. No one defended him against the accusations of the law. Everyone betrayed him. They left him to die. This is why Thomas confessed that unless he could touch the consequence of his sin, he would not believe that his sin was defeated.
This brings a new layer to the crucifixion, doesn't it?
With that in mind, let's turn to the second instance in which Paul confounds the legal scheme of distributive justice, Galatians 3:13. Again, remember, Jesus is Lord, and God promised, "This is my Son, the beloved." And yet that very same Son was hung from a tree. And as Paul identifies in quoting Deuteronomy 21, "Cursed by God is anyone hung from a tree." Now, the key to understanding this is found in John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he sent his only Son. In other words, it was the Father's will to send his Son to go under the law and experience the curse of God's wrath.
So his death wasn't just an unfortunate end, it was by design?
To recognize this is to realize that Christ hanging from the cross was no accident. It was not a mistake. It was not a miscarriage of justice. It was exactly what the Father sent the Son to do. This is why Paul says Christ became a curse for our sake. And this is why Luther said Christ was the greatest of all sinners. And even more, said Luther, Christ ceased being a person who bore our sin, but he actually became sin. Steve Paulson uses a nice analogy to this point. Quote, sometimes a person is so associated with something that we stop using an adjective and use the substantive. A bodybuilder can, at a certain point, cease having muscles, and we call him all muscle, end quote. Christ becomes so exclusively associated with sin that it loses any sense for anyone else. And we say of him not only that he is a sinner, but the sinner.
And even Christ questioned this, feeling forsaken on the cross?
Let's recall the promise God gave to his Son. This is my Son, the beloved. Now fast forward to that same beloved Son hanging on a tree under the curse of God. At that moment, we hear Jesus' own unbelief in that promise as he cried out to God. He no longer feels beloved, but now feels forsaken. Simply put, Jesus confesses unbelief, sin. At that moment, the law did as it must. It heard the sin, the unbelief, and attacked Christ and killed him. The law did exactly as God intended. It attacked sin and killed it.
Powerful insight, Sarah. So Paul's message is that the cross represents more than just forgiveness?
This is precisely what Paul confessed, and what the philosophers and logicians could never reconcile. Christ became a curse. He who knew no sin became sin.